Hi everyone, I wrote this one back in 2018. It's based on an urban legend from Japan. Hope you enjoy. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share. The train roared as it escaped Hamamatsucho station. As she briskly walked home, air conditioners exhaled putridly hot, stale restaurant air into the streets. The city was alive with noise and movement despite the late hour. The welcome jingles of convenience stores chimed. Motorbikes revved in the distance. Rusted metal shop signs creaked in the wind. The scent of roasting meat and charcoal was in the air. Someone retched in the distant alley of the metropolitan labyrinth. Dead-eyed women glared from billboards at amorous salarymen, offering wishes to be granted for a price. A bicycle whizzed past, white headphones crammed into his ears. Someone tried to thrust a flyer into her hand without words. Red light, don't walk. Her feet ached, her clothes reeked of passive smoke. Another 10-hour shift was finally over. An old man cleared his throat while he stared at her. No words, just silent judgment. Green light, walk. Someone stepped on her foot without apology in the mad dash to be first across the road. Eyes peered over face masks. What's the purpose of that surgical contraption? To prevent germs or to hide gaunt expressions? Music blared beneath blacked-out windows of a sports car. Prices in bright neon lights vomited colors onto the crowded streets. She clutched her purse tightly. Someone rang their bicycle bell as if to demand she shift aside. She apologized, but the cyclist ignored her. Through the window of a noodle restaurant, she saw rows of heads buried in bowls and a sweaty-browed chef grinning. Up ahead, the green light was already blinking as she rounded the corner. She made a half-hearted dash to cross in time, but winced and slowed as the light turned a bright red. Ayako felt the beginnings of a migraine looming like thunderclouds on an autumn afternoon. Electronic bells were continuing to ring in her ear despite work being concluded for the day. The bells meant a customer has placed an order through the touch panel at their table. The bells meant hurry, the customer is king, ding dong, better move girl, better hurry, otherwise you'll be in trouble. In an attempt to ignore her own garbled and exhausted thoughts, Ayako craned her neck into a familiar downward position as she pulled out her smartphone. The bells, quasi-Ayako, she thought, while plugging her earphones into her ears, softly smiling in amusement. A bony finger prodded her in the back. She leapt in shock and pulled her earphones out. Being the timorous type, she slightly cowered as she turned. "Could you do something for me, miss? I have a small request. If you were to fulfill it, we would be ever so grateful." We? Ayako thought. There was only one person in front of her, a woman she guessed in her late 30s, in a long light brown coat. A face mask covered her mouth. Ayako imagined that her request would be something to do with money. Before she could prepare an excuse to refuse, the stranger continued. "Kasumi's in the hospital. She's been stricken with a very rare heart disease, and the doctors are baffled of how she may have caught it. She will undergo a form of surgery next week, and we're praying for a safe procedure. There aren't many documented cases of this disease in the world, so at the very least we're nervous for Kasumi. My request isn't for money or sympathy. All I wish you to do is gift me an origami crane to ensure Kasumi has a speedy recovery. Could you do that?" The stranger bowed her head and outstretched her arms, offering a notebook to Ayako. "Please make one," she sharply whispered. Ayako was moved by Kasumi's plight, but slightly unnerved by the stranger's brazen and unusual request. This was the first person who had bothered to speak to her outside of her work colleagues since she had moved to Tokyo. It felt refreshing to speak to someone new, and the request wasn't exactly demanding. "Well, of course I will," Ayako beamed. The stranger's eyes widened as Ayako delicately folded the torn-out sheet of notepaper. Ayako looked up nervously and smiled occasionally whenever she heard impressed noises escape from behind the face mask of her new friend. Despite it being July, wind chilled her fingers as they meticulously folded the wings of the crane. Ayako sat it upright on the palm of her hand and offered it to the lady. "What beautiful work you can create. Such skill and dexterity." Ayako was pleased that the small gesture seemed to have brightened the day of another. "Well, I really must be going now. Please wish Kasumi all the best from me. I hope she gets better soon." Her new friend was still analyzing the crane, turning it in all directions in her hands. Ayako began to leave as the traffic light began blinking green. Ayako felt a hand grip around her wrist. "I'm sorry. I just have one more thing to ask you. Please write your name and a little bit of information about yourself. I know Kasumi would love to one day thank you and anyone else who took the time to make a crane for her in her time of need." Seeing it as the fastest way to end this conversation and to be on her way home, she politely accepted. An old dirty notebook was handed to her, different to the one before. She flipped through the pages of the book to find a clean one. Hundreds of names and telephone numbers, filling the faint blue lines, whizzed past before her eyes. She added her own name and information and handed it back. The stranger snatched it out of her hands, uttered a quick word of thanks, and turned her back on Ayako, and then disappeared into the crowd of oncoming Tokyoites. In glimpses, Ayako would see that brown coat appear momentarily between business suits and blouses. Only light rainfall snapped Ayako out of the confusion created by the abrupt ending. She opened her umbrella and made her way home. Ayako momentarily looked up from her textbooks to gaze numbly at the glowing digits of her digital clock. She had been studying all morning. She poured more coffee and made her way back to her desk. On the 25th of the month, Ayako would be sitting possibly the most important exam of her young life. Pressure was mounting. A pitter-patter of rain drummed her window. She rushed to her balcony to bring her work clothes inside, needing them for that evening. There just wasn't enough time for everything: a job, studies, a social life. As she hung her clothes in her wardrobe, she heard her phone buzzing beneath the pillow on her bed before falling silent. She checked the call log and there was a number of missed calls, 6 of which were voicemails. Her mind suddenly conjured images of her parents in hospital beds, while white-coated doctors loomed over them, clutching clipboards. What other scenario would require such a demand of her attention? She hastily played the messages. "I'm calling to see if you'll make another. Not many people are as kind-hearted as you see." The second message clicked to life. "I'm calling again. Thank you for your support. Today was very slow. Could you make 3? The third message crackled. The tone panicked. "She got worse overnight. I pray that you make 10. We are counting on you." The fourth message was shrill. "I hope you've made a start because we need more. We need 15. This is important. A life is at stake. I hope you understand the severity of this." Ayako swallowed nervously as the 5th message played. "I'm starting to think that you're not as kind as I thought. I'm not asking for a lot. 19, that's all." The last message began with rasped breaths before a snide voice filled the earpiece. "You had better have made a start." The initial relief in the knowledge that her parents weren't hurt was washed away by a new, different, disquieting feeling. As she pressed end, the phone immediately started buzzing again. Ayako stared at it. A cold sweat amassed her brow. A percussion of raindrops on windows permeated the silence between each buzz. She had decided to answer it. "Hello?" "What's taking so long? What are you doing?" An angry voice hissed. Ayako, still stunned, remained silent. Her eyes darted around the room. "Don't you want Kasumi to get better?" A light went on in Ayako's mind. That lady! The one who wanted that origami crane. It happened over a week ago. She barely remembered it. Ayako began. She rubbed the sweat from her forehead and adjusted her glasses. Make 27 more cranes. Get them ready for collection, the voice ordered aggressively. Ayako managed the muster to ask, who? For Kasumi, the voice screamed. Make sure they're perfect. Ayako heard a click, then a dial tone. The phone felt hot in her hand, so she threw it down on the bed. Ayako stood there in silence for a moment, with her laundry still draped over her shoulder, staring at the phone. Later that evening, the restaurant was exceptionally busy. Dour-faced customers barked orders at Ayako, but her mind was elsewhere. She raced back and forth, with delivering food and drinks to different tables, all the while contemplating her new problem. Eriko, a fellow server, and the closest thing Ayako could call a friend, had noticed Ayako's demeanor, and, during their shared break, decided to ask about it. With a heavy sigh, Ayako filled her in on the details, and proceeded to play the voice messages for her. What should I do? Ayako asked, with a tight smile, and a breathy, forced laugh. It was an attempt at mellowing the conversation. She didn't want Eriko to know that the calls had occupied her mind with worry. Eriko chuckled, but her furrowed brow betrayed concern. She pushed her short hair behind her ears and replied, Honestly, I would just ignore it. She'll probably give up eventually, right? That's kind of harsh, though. Maybe if I just talk to... Eriko cut her off. If you talk to her, you give her oxygen. The more you give her, the more she'll take. The best way to avoid someone is to ignore them, and it starts right now. Eriko reached over and plucked the phone from Ayako's hands and turned it off. Quit worrying. No one calls anymore. No one really wants to talk to anyone nowadays. Anyway, I'm heading back out there. Don't turn that thing back on. Ayako smiled and exhaled through her nose. She twisted her long, dark hair around her fingers alone in the break room, contemplating Eriko's advice. Shadows danced across apartment buildings, projected by passing car headlights. Naked tree branches jutted like fingers towards her as she briskly walked home. Ayako had decided to alter her route home that night. She was eager to avoid another meeting with that woman. Her dark eyes darted back and forth at traffic lights, searching and scanning for that woman in the brown coat. When pedestrian footsteps fell behind her, Ayako would either cross the road or turn around and try another path. All her senses were heightened, save for her sense of direction. She had wandered down a few too many unfamiliar streets and managed to get herself lost. She was faced with a difficult decision: turn her phone on and open the Maps application, or try to guess her way back home. She decided to go with the phone. Listening to music would calm her down as an added bonus. It was her phone, and just because she had a nuisance caller didn't mean she would yield to never using it again. A tirade of voicemail messages and missed-call notifications appeared on her screen. She sighed. Ayako opened the Map application and began walking in the right direction. She played some music and began to unclench for a moment. Ayako stopped dead in her tracks when her upbeat music was replaced by the genetic trill of her ringtone. She debated internally to answer or cancel the call. She reminded herself of Eriko's advice. Don't give her oxygen. Why? Why so many calls and messages? What could she be saying now? Curiosity began to bloom inside her. She continued walking and questioning the motives of the stranger. The phone began to ring again. Ayako instantly cancelled the call. She felt anger and irritation rising inside her. Stress was mounting. She marched into a convenience store, and on a whim she decided to buy cigarettes. She had always enjoyed the smell of her father's cigarette wafting into her parents' home as he sat by the sliding door, sipping a can of beer on a hot day. She longed for the comforts of home. She reached into the chiller and picked up a can of her own. Ayako made it home before another downpour. Alone on her balcony, she paced back and forth, smoking and sipping her father's favorite beer, watching the direction of the rain beneath the streetlights. Nothing but rainfall could be heard as she contemplated her own situation. She stared at the empty field across from her house. It was showing signs of waterlogging. The rain was unrelenting. Amidst the swirl of rainfall, she thought she could see shapes moving in the distant field. She threw her cigarette over the balcony and watched the red embers disappear into the darkness. As she re-entered her apartment, she heard the phone ringing in her bedroom. Out of mild inebriation or perhaps curiosity, she decided to torment herself by listening to the voicemails. Each message was rife with the predictable demands of more and more origami cranes. The voice became increasingly irritated and demanding. Ayako reached the most recent message, one which she received a mere 2 minutes prior. There was a sharp intake of breath followed by, "How dare you? You haven't been working at all, have you?" the voice screamed. "Don't you think I'm aware of what you're doing? Kasumi is dying. The least you can do is help by making more cranes. We need 87. You smoke and you drink on your balcony while Kasumi lies on her deathbed, you selfish." Ayako screamed and hurled the phone across the room. Tears filled her eyes as the message continued to play across the room. The phone hissed static noises and shrieks as it lay on the floor. Her breath was caught in her throat, her heart hammered against her chest. "She knows where I live," Ayako whimpered, bringing a hand to cover her trembling lips. She scrambled to her front door and deadbolted it. She contemplated looking through the peephole, but the thought of seeing her caller peering back at her was too frightening. Ayako raced to the balcony's sliding door and slammed the lock shut and drew the curtains. She ran to her bed, that safe haven from childhood where monsters would never dare invade. She dived under the duvet and sobbed as her phone lay by the front door vibrating on the hardwood floor. My advice to you would be to ensure your doors and windows are locked every night, and most importantly, ignore any calls or messages you receive, miss, the officer stated in a rehearsed drawl. The midday sun shone through the slatted blinds and created bars of shadow and light on the reception desk. His stony face didn't harbor a trace of concern for the trembling young lady in front of him. Ayako stood aghast. She had learned very recently that ignoring a problem doesn't make it disappear. She could feel tears beginning to sting the corners of her eyes, but wouldn't allow them to be wasted on this cold obelisk of a man. Unable to seem rude, she muttered a thank you and left the police station. Through day and night, Ayako kept an eye over her shoulder, nervously watching for her stalker. She could feel eyes on her as she walked the streets, while she waited on tables at work and as she made her way home. She was filled with more and more questions each day. Did I write my address down in her gritty little book? I'm sure I didn't. How could she see me on my third-floor balcony in the driving rain? Over time, Ayako became increasingly nervous to leave her apartment. She lived with the lights off, eager to give the impression that no one was home. At first, she ate nothing but instant food, ramen, cups of soup, and pasta, and then nothing at all. Her complexion began to grow pale and psoriasis bloomed in patches of her skin, causing it to flake. She had neglected her studies and began to miss shifts at work. For Ayako, the mundane had turned into the petrifying. Nights were the hardest for the young girl from the countryside. She was used to quiet nights, filled with the chirps of bugs. Tokyo was different. Every noise racked her senses. Unknown footfall on metal stairs of her building, voices in the streets below, squeaks and creaks of something unseen. Although she was terrified, she never buckled. Ayako had committed herself to the idea of keeping her lights off to make it seem as if she wasn't home, and she wasn't going to change her mind. But the noises, they were far worse in the darkness. She wouldn't use a torch to get from room to room, and unplugged everything which had a standby light. She didn't dream of touching her phone again. Had she turned it on, she would have found a number of calls and messages from someone else besides her stalker. Her mother. Ayako's parents had grown concerned, as they hadn't heard from her in a number of days. Ayako's birthday was next month, and her mother had been trying to get in touch with her to plan a visit. The storm outside was worsening. Wind and rain lashed her windows like ravenous tongues. Flashes of lightning partially illuminated her apartment. A crack of boom breached the rumbling storm and jumped her out of her skin. Ayako sat there with her neck craned, peering downwards to the floor. She was on edge for some innate reason. She silently drummed her fingers on the left side of her chair. Was that knocking? Or just the storm? She prayed for the latter. Once again, knocking came louder. She sat frozen, staring towards the door. Light flickered beneath the door, as if to indicate feet were on the other side. Again, the knocking came, louder. A flash of lightning briefly illuminated her apartment again. Her lips quivered. She clasped her hands to her mouth. She daren't make a sound. "There's nobody here. There's nobody home. Please go away," she internally chanted, yet the knocking persisted. "Ayako, how many have you made?" the familiar voice asked from behind the door. It called her name tunefully, like a mother calling her child, like her mother. It wasn't angry this time, but it was still beyond terrifying for Ayako. Feeling the urge to scream rising inside, Ayako bit her fist. Ayako truly believed that there was still a chance that the stalker would think that there was no one home. Just like hiding under the duvet, the ghosts and demons think you aren't there. Her teeth dug sharply into her knuckle and forefinger as the voice continued to call her name in that tuneful way. A slamming sound suddenly began. She's trying to break the door open. She actually wants to come in and do who knows what to me, Ayako's mind screamed. Ayako lamented in silence and allowed tears to stream down her face, scared the sound of wiping them away or sniffing would alert her unwanted visitor. "Why did I write my name in that fucking book?" she roared in her mind. The short bursts of slamming continued. She thought about grabbing her phone and calling the police in that instance. But a much more immediate and harrowing thought jumped to the forefront of her mind. Is the door just on the chain? Is that the sound of opening and closing? Ayako whimpered, with her arms outstretched as she tiptoed closer to the door. There in the hallway, just before the genkan, she saw her door opening and closing. Rain had soaked the floor. The stranger was still wearing her face mask and brown coat. She was grunting as she was pushing her weight against the door. She hadn't noticed Ayako because she was transfixed on smashing the door open. Ayako thought about screaming for help. She was so dismally disappointed that none of her neighbors had come to see what the noise was about. "They're ignoring it," a voice inside whispered. The eyes above the face mask locked onto Ayako as lightning struck. In that instance, fight or flight kicked in. Ayako ran to her door screaming, slid on the rainwater, and forced her body weight up against the door. The rain-soaked door chain was hanging on by a single screw. Ayako's strength wasn't a match for the stranger's. The door was slightly forced open again. "Let me in. I've come to collect them. Give me the cranes. Why don't you give them to me? Kasumi is dying," the awful woman demanded. "I don't have any. Go away. I'm calling the police," Ayako screamed back. "None." The stranger's voice sounded inhuman. Fingers craned around the frame of the door and into Ayako's apartment. Ayako shrieked and shoulder barged the door onto them. A scream of pain filled Ayako's ears. There were fingers in her door at that moment, and Ayako wanted them to be broken, cut off. She pushed harder and harder on the door. Blood spurted through the surface of the skin, followed by a splinter of bone. They still twisted and coiled towards her, like blood-soaked serpents with bone dorsal fins. Ayako heard the maniac sobbing and wailing. She relieved the pressure, and the bloody fingers withdrew. "You crushed my fingers! I'm nothing but a charitable woman. How could you? I'll be back. You'll slip up again, and next time I'll get in. And I'll get those 479 cranes you promised. Maybe you'll have to make more, because how can I possibly make any now? I'll be back to get what's owed. I'll come back. I'll come back." Ayako used the last of her energy to deadbolt the lock, and then collapsed. "She will reply when she gets a chance. Don't worry, she's a big girl now," Mr. Ito assured his wife. "Well, I'd feel a lot better if we could just find out for ourselves. Come on, get in the car. I can't rest until I know she's all right," she replied, pleading with her eyes. Mr. Ito joined his wife in his 91 Suzuki mini-truck. He adjusted his mirrors, gave an upward half smile, and started the ignition. It's only 2.5 hours to Tokyo. Weak, malnourished, and sleep-deprived, Ayako sat vigilantly with her back against the door, unmoving despite the pain. Several nights had passed since the onslaught of the lady in the brown coat. She hadn't followed through with that threat of her return yet. Pangs of hunger stung Ayako's stomach. Her skin flaked and her hair had faded to a ghostly grey. Around Ayako sat hundreds of immaculately folded cranes in congregation. Ayako's fingers were scored by paper cuts, and her hands were rendered claw-like, yet she diligently continued, performing a breathy head count occasionally. The cranes all faced their skeletal creator, watching silently like members of a jury. Ayako guarded that door, with all of her body's depleting resources, clutching the door handle with one raised, blood-drained arm. She thought of calling for help or calling the police, but knew the instant she moved from the door it would burst open, or once again her calls for help and advice would be ignored. She tried to decide which idea was more frightening as sleep came to take her. Try calling again. I already told you her phone is turned off. Well, let's get the landlord. I mean, he must have a key. We can't stand here knocking all morning. There seems to be something against the door, the landlord stated. Well, I'll help you push then, offered Mr. Ito. As the door edged open, Mrs. Ito saw a bony arm and emitted a shrill, pained cry. Ayako, wake up! Her father boomed. Ayako opened her eyes and was immediately blinded by the morning sun. She could hear sobbing and felt strong arms around her. She made a feeble attempt to lash out at her captors before realizing that it was her parents. She closed her eyes again and smiled for the first time in a long while. You're coming home with us. What has happened to my little girl? Her mother questioned. Welcome back, Mr. and Mrs. Ito. We are pleased with Ayako's recovery. Initially, we suspected some mental health issues, but as the months progressed, we're confident that it is not the case. She often spoke of a woman stalking her, and we suspected paranoia schizophrenia, but she has sufficiently proven our initial diagnosis to be incorrect. She has calmed over the months and has finally accepted that no one is pursuing her. Mr. and Mrs. Ito were sat in the doctor's office. Mr. Ito glanced around the room and his eyes landed on a photo of the doctor and his son fishing. Unless it wasn't in her head, the police are still investigating the case, Mr. Ito said sternly. His eyes met the doctor's again. Of course, as it stands, she seems to be healthy, and I'm certain she wouldn't be a danger to herself or others, which is why I'm happy to sign the discharge paperwork today. Well, that is wonderful news, exclaimed Mrs. Ito. I will say, Mr. Ito, the less said about this lady she constantly referred to would go a long way in aiding her recovery. Perhaps she's real, perhaps she isn't. It would be in everybody's best interest to ignore the matter. Wouldn't you agree? Mr. Ito looked at the bespectacled doctor and solemnly nodded. Yes, of course, doctor. May we see her now? Asked Mrs. Ito, while watching raindrops slithering down the wire-meshed window pane. Absolutely. Nurse Obata is walking her over from the ward now. Alarm bells rang in a distant corridor. Mr. and Mrs. Ito ignored them and continued to wait patiently for their daughter to arrive in Dr. Kaminiwa's office. The doctor's phone began to ring. No, that's impossible. Well, yes, I understand. I'll be there momentarily, he said to the unseen caller. Mr. and Mrs. Ito watched on through the viewing window, helpless to the situation as Ayako thrashed madly in the hospital bed. The nurses amassed around her, attempting to hold her limbs down. She kicked and scratched and screamed at them. Dr. Kaminiwa primed a needle and aimed it towards Ayako's arm. He pulled the plunger and Ayako's thrashes and screams turned to listless kicks and whimpered cries before fading out. Now sedated, the nurses and the doctor joined Ayako's parents at the viewing window. What happened to her? I thought you said she was making progress, Mr. Ito asked, angrily. Nurse Obata, do tell us, snapped Dr. Kaminiwa. Nurse Obata's face held a look of concern, and she seemed as confused as Mr. and Mrs. Ito as she recanted what had happened. Yes, doctor, I was walking Ayako through the garden. She became agitated as the rain fell. A lady I hadn't seen before on the grounds walked over and offered Ayako an umbrella, and we took it gratefully. And then she said to Ayako, "Kasumi's dead. Let's see who makes cranes for you. Now you're next." Sarah walked the streets often by herself. She didn't mind if it was night or day. She was always confident in her surroundings, and just because she hadn't ever visited Tokyo before didn't mean that she would change her attitude. She felt independent and happy on her own while traveling. She stood waiting for a light to change green, staring at the vespertine sky. She pulled her smartphone out of her pocket and held it up, and wiped raindrops away as she looked at her notifications. She felt a sharp prod in her back. She turned angrily to meet the gaze of the one who dared to disturb her. A stranger stood before her. A face mask covered her mouth. "Could you do something for me, miss? I have a small request, but if you were to fulfill it, we would be ever so grateful," asked the stranger, wearing a long brown coat. Sarah thought, this is a new one. She had seen buskers, street performers, and cosplayers, but she had never seen a steely-eyed lone woman referring to herself as we. "Ayako is in the hospital. She's been stricken with a very rare heart disease, and the doctors are baffled of how she might have caught it." Sarah nodded empathetically. She had volunteered in the past and was touched by the plight of the young woman. Besides, it was only a small request. "Hey, it won't kill me. Sure, I'll make you an origami crane." The stranger's eyes widened. Well, thanks everyone if you managed to make it to the end of that one. That was an urban legend. It's about this request to make cranes, and then somehow you end up in hospital and somebody else is making cranes for you to get better, the next victim basically. They love their cyclical kind of curses, like, the ring pass on the videotape and stuff like that. I wrote that in Japan. A lot of the stuff in that story is based on what I would see where I lived, like the field where it was getting waterlogged and rainy. There was a huge field near where I lived. Like the streets you'd walk down pausing at the traffic lights and stuff. Anyway, I hope you liked it. I will go back to the true scary stories and the ghost stories and, woods and stuff like that. Don't worry, this is not a departure from that kind of stuff. It's just one I thought I'd throw online whilst I'm on holiday. Yep, right now I'm in Japan. I'm probably a couple of beers in at this time. It's being uploaded, or I'm sound asleep. I haven't figured out the time zone quite yet. But yeah, anyway, I hope you enjoyed it, and let me know if you'd like to hear more of my own stories. I'll see you soon.